Okay, Richard, can you tell us what a 10-pound pom is?
Well, I'm one, aren't I? It meant that Australia was so short of potential workers, and the White Australia policy was going like the clappers, so they wanted to import people from Europe. And there was a scheme that British people could apply to come to Australia and only pay £10 to get here. And the deal was that you had to stay for 2 years, or you could go home before 2 years, but then you had to reimburse the government with the balance of the £10 or whatever the fare was, and
Well,
had to pay your return fare home.
You've been here 50 years. Why did you decide to come to Australia?
Well, because I had an agreement with my sister that we would both travel, so I didn't really intend to stay here. I intended to stay for the 2 years and then go back to London. But I'd only been here for 3 weeks when I decided I didn't want to go back to London.
What was the boat trip, Al? It must have been a long one.
It was just over 6 weeks, and it was quite good fun, really. There were a few Australians. In those days, Australians all went to England to work for a couple of years, and so the majority of the people on the boat were in fact migrants with children, but there was a small percentage of Australians returning to Australia from their big trip. So it was good fun.
When you got to Sydney, you'd been living in London prior to that in Holland Park, so you came to Sydney. What was it like? Was there a big contrast?
Of course there was a big contrast. We sailed in through the Heads, and I must confess that I had seen pictures of the Harbour Bridge, but I rather expected it to be across the Heads. And I was somewhat disappointed when it wasn't. But we sailed into Woolloomooloo, and of course we could see Macquarie Street from before we got into Woolloomooloo, and the tallest building was the Astor, which was of course painted a very whitey sort of colour.
So as soon as you get off the boat after the voyage, what are you thinking?
Well, because I was with another single man, they didn't send us to a migrant hostel. They actually sent us to a boarding house, or perhaps we called a guest house, in Neutral Bay. Oh. And our cases were to arrive later, so we were ensconced in this room in the boarding house at Neutral Bay, and I thought, I'll just go for a little walk. And you know, when you get out into a street, it was Wickham Road in Neutral Bay, oh, yeah. And of course everybody walking down Wickham Road would have walked to the ferry at Neutral Bay, and I went by the most direct route to the ferry at Neutral Bay, and there was a ferry just coming in, and I got on it, and I'm sitting there thinking, I wonder where the conductor is. Nobody's asked me for any money yet, you know. And we went all the way to Circular Quay, and you didn't have to pay, of course, until you went through the turnstile at Circular Quay, and you bought a little token which you poked into the turnstile and it let you through.
How easy was it to settle in?
Well, for me it was very easy because we were living in a boarding house, so we got our breakfast supplied and our dinner supplied. Well, I'd been used to looking after myself, so I couldn't get it out of my head that I was on holiday. You know, I had to stand behind the counter at David Jones for 8 hours a day, but that was all jolly good fun.
So you had a job at David Jones, and that was in women's wear?
No,
ladies'
in
wear?
dress material.
In dress material?
Yes.
And did you have any exciting adventures in that job? Did you meet anybody well known?
Oh, well, strange you should ask that, William. Because I was standing there musing one day. I'd been here probably 2 or 3 months, and I was thinking, what am I doing here? I don't know any of these people. And I'm standing gazing at the top of the escalator where the people were coming up from the ground floor. And suddenly, there was this familiar face came off the escalator. And I rushed over to this woman and I said, hello, what are you doing in Australia? And then I suddenly realised that I didn't know this woman at all. It was Joyce Grenfell. And
wow.
She was so gracious and lovely. She said, well, you know, she said, I'm actually here to do a review at the Phillip Street Theatre.
Gosh. And didn't you see her a few years later again?
I did. Later on I was doing the executive training course for David Jones, and I was supervising in the skirt department. and somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned round, and it was Joyce Grenfell, and she said, "How are you getting on?"
And she came out all this way just to see you?
No, she came out for another review at Phillip Street Theatre.
So you've been back to England a few times.
I have.
How does it compare to what you remember? Has it changed?
Well, it has changed. I mean, if you go on the Underground in London now, you might be in Cairo or some big city in the Middle East. It doesn't really bear any resemblance travelling on public transport. But when you go out into the country, it's exactly the same. You go to a beautiful place like York and walk round the Minster, and it's exactly the same as it's always been. And yet I went to my hometown, Trowbridge, where my parents used to own a shop, a women's clothing shop, and the authorities had decided, in their wisdom or lack of it, to build a huge shopping centre in the middle of town. Escalators in Trowbridge, imagine that. And,
Sinful.
And it wasn't successful, but it succeeded in killing all the small businesses round the place, so that my mum and dad's shop looked so depressing. It had a big sign outside to let, as did half the shops in the street.
Oh dear.
And you know, the paint was peeling off and it looked neglected and sad.
So it's changed a lot, but there must be things you miss about England.
Old buildings, cathedrals, friends.
Has Sydney changed a lot over the last 50 years?
Well, of course it has. If the Astor was the tallest building in Macquarie Street in 1958...
That was 8 stories, wasn't it?
About 8 stories.
And now they go way up. You've got Centre Point, which are many floors.
I mean, it's a different place. It's not the same place.
And one,
It's hard.
it hasn't. Many people say that, definitely. One last question. What's the best thing about living in Sydney?
Sitting here...
Would you ever move back to England?
No.
Well, Richard, thanks very much.